we deepen our knowledge of God and our understanding and our belief in God when we begin to recognize and acknowledge God actually at work in our daily lives and the things we go through and the ups we go through and the downs we go through. And if one begins to know God, one can teach little children the fear of God. If you do wrong, you will be punished, and if you do good, you will be rewarded. But the child only begins to understand more about what this pathway is, since God is invisible, when we teach the child how to recognize that the miracles of everyday life, the functioning of the body, our ability to stretch and move and walk and all the things we do, these are all gifts, precious gifts of God. The very fact that we have been given life, that the sun rises in the morning, goes down, and there's the cycle of the seasons, and because of that we're able to get our food and our needs and so on and forth. We have to acknowledge God. And the Shabbat is a time for acknowledging God. Zecher l'maaseh bereshit, in memory of the work of creation. We stop from our activities, from our slavery to the world of computers and cars and errands and everything else. We just stop to reflect and think and meditate, to get to discharge energy, electrical energy, and to just calm and realize there's a greater dimension to existence. Now, particularly in times of crisis, if a person gets through it during the crisis, people scream in terror. And after the crisis is over, we see the difference between Pharaoh. Once that Pharaoh, every time there was a crisis, he would scream and run to Moses to take it away. But as soon as the plague left, back to normal business. There's a very great well-known British philosopher that was very influential to me personally in a very negative way as a child, as a teenager, and to many others. One of the sources of British philosophical atheistic materialism, who was preaching atheism for most of his life, but towards the end of his life he had a near-death experience. He experienced clinical death. And when he woke out of it and came back, he said, everything I've been teaching is all wrong. But as the time went on from that experience, he started reverting to his philosophy, and then God finally took him from the world. But we find in Psalm 107 a discussion about suffering and a teaching about suffering and a crises and danger, and the appropriate response when we are saved from some kind of mortal danger. And the response is to give thanks to God for his kindnesses. And it's with this Psalm 107, reflecting on its teachings, that we will begin to approach the subjects of thanksgiving and of Chunakah. Psalm 107, give thanks to God for he is good, for his kindness is forever. Let those who have been redeemed by God, that he redeemed from the hand of the enemy, he gathered them in from the lands, from the east, from the west, from the north, from the south. They were astray in the wilderness, in the devastating place. They could find no road to a city or any civilization. They were starving, they were thirsty. Their very souls were fainting in them. But they cried out to God out of their trouble, and he saved them from their travails. And he led them on a straight path to go to the city of habitation. Give thanks to God for his kindness and his wonders to the children of men, for he has satisfied the thirsty soul, and he has filled the hungry soul with good. So that is the first category of people who are lost in the wilderness. It's all very well today when we have GPS and satellite pictures of Earth all the time being relayed to everybody, but 100 years ago and more, if you were lost in the jungle or the desert, you were very likely never ever to return home. And therefore somebody who has been saved from such a fate, including the children of Israel who were astray in the wilderness, they should rightly give thanks when they get to a civilized place in a city. The psalm continues, verse 10, those who dwell in the darkness of the shadow of death, they are imprisoned in poverty and metal, because they rebelled against the word of God and they despised the counsel of the Supreme. And he humbled their hearts with toil. They stumbled with none to help them. But they cried out to God out of their trouble, and he saves them from their travails. He brings them out from darkness and the shadow of death, and he takes off their bonds. Give thanks to God for his kindness, his wonders to the children of men. For he has broken the doors of bronze, and the locks of iron has he torn up. So here is the second category of people that were imprisoned in captivity. Does Jonathan Pollard ever imagine he will walk out alive from prison? Many others who are unknown and rotting away in prisons in God knows where, North Korea and Iran and Syria on this side, on that side. God forbid. And when they're saved, if they're saved from this darkness, Joseph, who was saved out of prison, time to give thanks to God for his wonders to children of men. Continuing now with verse 17. Crazed from the path of their sins, they were sick from their sins. All food their soul abominated, and they came to the very gates of death. This is a case of severe illness, but they cried out to God out of their trouble, and he saves them from their travails. He sends his word, and he heals them and saves them from their destructions. Give thanks to God for his kindness and wonders to the children of men. So that's the third category, illness. We had lost in the wilderness, we had imprisoned, we have now the person who's so crazed with illness that everything is opposite to him. And verse 22, let them give offerings, the offerings of the Todah, the thanksgiving. Let them offer the thanksgiving offering in the temple, and let them tell his works in joy. And now the fourth and last category of danger enumerated in this psalm, danger of somebody sinking in a ship at sea and in danger of drowning. Those who go down to the sea in boats, who perform the work in many waters, they saw the works of God and his wonders in the very depths. For he spoke, and he set up the storm wind, and he made high the waves. They went up to the heavens, they went down to the depths, and their souls were spinning in the evil of their situation. They were swirling, and they were swaying around like a drunk, and all of their wisdom was totally thrown into confusion. But they cried out to God in their pain, and he saved them from their travails. He stood still the storm wind and silenced it, and the waves of the sea became calm, and they rejoiced, for they were again tranquil, and he led them to the destination of their desire. Let them give thanks to God for his kindness and his wonders to the children of men. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people, and let them praise him in the session of the elders. And the concluding part of the psalm speaks about God's capacity to turn everything around completely. He turns rivers into a wilderness. He turns the sources of water into a parched place. The fruitful land he turns into a salty, fruitless land on account of the wickedness of its inhabitants. Everything depends upon the moral state of the people, their prosperity or lack of it. He will turn the wilderness, however, into a pool of water, and the thirsty land he can turn into a land flowing with water. And those living there who were hungry, he establishes them into a city of habitation. They sow their fields, they tend their vineyards, and they make the fruit of the produce, and he blesses them, and they greatly multiply, and their cattle also he will not make small. But then they became small and they became lowly on account of evil and sighing. Yet God will ultimately bring redemption. He pours contempt upon the mighty, and he makes them go astray in a devastation that is no pathway, while he raises up the needy from impoverishment, and he makes the needy like a flock of successful families. The righteous will see and they will rejoice, and all evil will shut its mouth. We're left speechless. Who is wise, who will guard these things, this wisdom that the psalm writer has spoken of, and he will contemplate the kindnesses of God. Rabbi said that from this psalm we learn that there are 4 categories of people who are obliged to give a thanksgiving. Those who have been astray in the wilderness, those who have been in captivity, those who have been in dire illness, and those who have been in a dangerous sea voyage. And they've instituted that these 4 categories of people would, in temple times, bring to the temple the sacrifice of thanksgiving that is enumerated in Leviticus. And it's alluded to in the psalm, because the psalm says in verse 22, they will sacrifice the sacrifices of thanksgiving and tell his works in joy. The archetypal prototype of all thanksgiving feasts was on the night that Israel went out of Egypt, when God had commanded them already to take the lamb, to slaughter the lamb, to daub the blood on their doorposts, and then to roast the lamb and sit around, the whole family, the whole chavurah, the whole group of friends together, and after that meal they would get up and walk out of Egypt. And it was laid down from then on that every year on the eve of the 15th of Nisan, the night of the 15th of Nisan, the children of Israel would mark the Passover with a sacrifice in Jerusalem in the temple of the lamb, which each family would take home and roast and sit around, not only to enjoy the roast lamb, which is a very great savory, but to actually tell the story. Like the verse says in here, verse 22, it says, they will sacrifice the sacrifice of thanksgiving and tell his works in joy. That is the saying of the Haggadah, the story of the exile and the redemption told on the night of Pesach. And that is the archetypal Thanksgiving feast. There's also a successor to this, which is the Purim feast, because the miracle of Purim happened actually on Pesach. It was on the Pesach festival that year that the miracle happened, but they instituted the Purim holiday on the day that Haman had decreed extermination for all of the Jews. The 13th of Adar, they were to fast, and the following day, the day of their victory, they were instructed by Mordechai and Esther, a year after the miracle, to make a feast. On Purim there are 4 main markings of the festival: the reading of the scroll of Esther, the giving of charity to the needy, the exchanging of portions of cooked food between friends ready to eat, to celebrate, and finally at the end of the day to sit down at the table with family and friends and make the Purim feast. The Purim feast is like the Seder night, also a feast of thanksgiving for deliverance from a miracle. So the rabbi said that 4 categories in particular, besides the national miracles, are required to bring thanksgiving for individual miracles, to be saved from a shipwreck alive, or prison, get out alive, or any of the other categories, serious life-threatening illness, and being lost in the wilds. The person needs to mark and understand and internalize and see how God has actually come into his or her life and give thanks for that. Well, today we do not have the temple, but our sages instituted a blessing that is said by somebody who has experienced such a miracle, somebody who was ill, who went through surgery, who was in a dangerous accident and came out alive, or a woman who was given birth. All of these categories and more, where relevant, may come to the synagogue and fulfill what is written in the later part of the psalm. The later part of the psalm says that, verse 32, they shall exalt God in the assembly of the people, and in the session of the elders shall they praise him. According to the words of the text here, the time for expressing your thanksgiving is at a public occasion. Let them exalt him in the assembly of the people. And we learn from other sections of the Torah that the assembly of the people is a minimum of 10 people, a prayer quorum, a minyan. And of them this should be in the session of the elders, the Moshav Zakenim, the session of the elders. The minimum number of elders would be 2. The minimum plural of anything is 2. So there should be there, besides or included among the 10 assembly of the people, the 10 male Israelites, there should also be 2 of them who are learned elders with possessing wisdom. And it's customary today, when somebody has come through a miracle alive, that they will come to the synagogue and the blessing is recited customarily at the time of the Torah reading on Shabbat. Because the Torah reading on Shabbat is when everybody will be in the synagogue, and at a convenient break in the reading, for example, the reading is divided between 7 people who are called to the reader's desk to read from the Torah, and they make their blessing over the reading of the Torah before and afterwards. And somebody who had been through a miracle would, after his blessing, after the reading of his portion, add the following blessing. If it was a woman who it's customary not to call to the reading of the Torah, she would also choose, or they would silence everybody at a particular break, and she would say the same blessing. And the blessing is, Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu Melech HaOlam. Blessed are you, my Lord, our God, King of the universe. Hagomel L'chayavim Tovot, who bestows even upon sinners goodnesses. Shegemalani Kol Tuv, who has bestowed on me everything good. That's the blessing. And when the people hear that blessing in the Hebrew, they will respond, Mi shegemalacha kol tuv, yigemalacha kol tuv selah. He who bestowed everything good upon you, he will bestow all good upon you forever. And that's it. There is also a custom which is mentioned in my book, The Call to Live, where somebody has been through a life-threatening illness and come out alive, or some other danger, to make actually a Sudat Hoda'ah, a feast of thanksgiving. And they will invite family and friends and people of note in their lives, and in the course of the meal will actually recite some prayers of thanksgiving and also perhaps speak informally about what they've been through and their recognition of what a miracle has happened. So with this background, I think we can, first of all, well imagine that back then in 1623, among the people who had come from Europe to America were people who either were actually Jewish and brought up Jewish, or who were from Jewish extraction, who had been, in some cases, forcibly converted to Christianity, but who would have known about the whole idea of Purim, and particularly of Chunakah, which I'll be speaking about later, which is the festival of Thanksgiving for Israel. So I think it's not at all unlikely that part of the early settlers in America were people of astonishing piety and sincerity and purity. They were fleeing from a Europe that was racked with wars, with religious persecution, with tyranny, and they were only too glad to get to even a completely unknown territory with unknown indigenous peoples and in some cases very harsh conditions. And I'm sure that with this background and the known respect of the Puritans and some of the others who were coming over that time for the Jewish and the Torah tradition, that they saw fit to join the idea of Thanksgiving that is found in the Torah and in the idea of Pesach, Chunakah, and Purim in the first Thanksgiving feast that were celebrated. We can be sure that all those who were there knew exactly what is mentioned in Psalm 107 about the dangers of a sea voyage in the winds. We can be sure that everybody who made that crossing on the Atlantic, and there were some who made it several times, and how they did it. I mean, I knew my grandmother who made the crossing in, it must have been about very early 1900s, and she told me that she was sick for the whole way. It was like she described, and that was already with modern steamships, and not with the kind of galleons and sail-driven, wind-driven boats they had then. So they were all known about this and about being lost in an unknown place. And I'm sure there were many who had been, many were sick and lost their lives. Those who came through sickness and the sudden exposure to all kinds of new things they'd not known from Europe, they'd have all very fully understood what the idea of Thanksgiving was to be. And I think that any serious-minded American who stands for the great principles upon which this country was founded, the great aspirations and the great dream of freedom and the dignity of the citizen, should particularly this year, the coincidence of Thanksgiving and Chunakah, take time for careful thought about where America is headed and where each of you is headed. And I'd like to, in that way, make the transition to speak about the significance of Chunakah and why Chunakah is so vitally relevant to the world today. And I'm prompted to speak about this in this way because I just momentarily heard the radio in the background in the hotel here, and of course they were talking about the Thanksgiving sales and the Thanksgiving turkey and this and that, and we all know that today for the overwhelming majority of the population, the actual meaning of Thanksgiving is completely lost and forgotten. It's just a good occasion to get together. People will fly all over the place. Lots of people make lots of money out of it, and the more the merrier, so it's emphasized. But who really stops to think about the true significance of Thanksgiving and what they had to give thanks about? They didn't have wireless internet and automobiles and the standard of living that is enjoyed today. So what were they giving thanks? I dare say they were also giving thanks for their escape from tyranny, their escape from persecution, their escape from autocracies that would not let people express themselves in the way they believe they need to live. And so they were doubtless giving thanks to have left that old world behind and to be ready to build a beautiful new dream on this amazing, beautiful continent of such wealth and such beauty and such staggering resources. Well, the story of Chunakah is well known. The Jews had entered into the land of Israel, the Israelites, the children of Israel, the tribes entered into the land of Israel under Joshua after hundreds of years of the judges. The prophet Samuel appointed a king over them, King Saul, we spoke about this last night, and then King David. And it is said that when David fled from Saul, the very first time he fled, when he realized that Saul was seriously out to kill him, it says in Tanakh that he went to a place called Nayot. It says that David and Samuel were bin Nayot. Well, Nayot today is a neighborhood in Jerusalem, but where the biblical location of Nayot was is, I dare say, open to speculation. But the rabbis tell us that the allusion in this verse in Samuel is the allusion to the Hebrew word for building, boneh. that actually Samuel and David, in this time when David was being mercilessly persecuted by Saul, all he was interested in was the temple. He went to Samuel to learn the design of the temple. There's a similar thing with Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, whose book on the secrets of the future temple is available here, who at the time he wrote this book, at the age of 22, he had all of the rabbis of Europe against him, about to excommunicate him and to tell him under no circumstances to write anymore, or certainly not to publish any more writings. And in the course of this merciless controversy, he's sitting there on this plane of tranquility writing this book. And King David already prepared everything for Solomon. Solomon came to the throne at a very young age. At the age of 12 or 13 was when he became king. And already David prepared everything, all of the design, and also all of the materials. David was an international ruler. He had friendship with the king of Tyre. It was all coming to Jerusalem, all in preparation for Solomon. Solomon's temple lasted for 410 years and was destroyed. They went into exile to Babylon, came back after 70 years, and that was when Ezra and Zerubbabel and the other returnees, Yeshua the high priest, built the second temple. And the second temple was built in the aftermath of the collapse of Babylon at the hands of Persia, and the second temple was actually built to a degree under the patronage of Persia. It was the Persian king, as described in Ezra, who permitted the building of the temple. But the empire of Persia came to an end when Alexander defeated Darius II in battle, and from that time the world power was Alexander. Alexander was a benign to the inhabitants of Judea. There is a tale told that the Samaritans, who were the peoples that Sennacherib had brought to the land of Israel after they exiled the 10 tribes, the Samaritans went to Alexander, who was marching down the coast from Asia Minor, down through Lebanon and Syria, down to Israel on his way to Egypt. They went to spread incitement against the inhabitants of Judea. And Alexander was marching towards Jerusalem on his way to capture the city and destroy it. And it said that the high priest, known as Simon the Just, Shimon HaTzadik, put on his priestly garments and walked on foot out towards Alexander. And as he came towards Alexander, who was of course riding on a horse, Alexander jumps off his horse onto the ground and bows to this very old man dressed up in this fine golden garment. And Alexander's companion said to him, "Well, why do you bow to this wizened old man?" He said, "Well, when I go on my battles, I see his face before me." And so Alexander would not listen to the seditious remarks of the Samaritans, and he spared Jerusalem. But after the death of Alexander, his very extensive empire fell into 4 parts. And it was the part that was Syria, Greater Syria, which is what the British and everybody else years ago called Palestine. All that area fell under the rule of somebody known as Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus Epiphanes. And he was one of those rulers who believed that he was God, and that his goal was to spread Greek culture, the culture of Alexander's empire, across everywhere. And so he saw himself as being compelled to break these recalcitrant Jews who refused to bow to any statue of an emperor, and let alone any idol. And this is the background to the Chunakah story. And with the Jews refusing to participate in this idolatry, the Jews were divided. There were some who were very Hellenized and who were quite willing to do this, like our Reform people today, who will do all kinds of things. But the the hardcore Judean Torah committed inhabitants were determined not to accept this Hellenistic imposition. This historical period is known to us as the exile under Greece. The catalogue is Egypt, Babylon, Persia, with Media, Greece, and Rome until the end of days, when it's Rome and Ishmael, Edom and Ishmael together. But at that time it was Greece, and the story is known, a very famous story told in the book of the Maccabees about Hannah, who was taken captive with her 7 sons, and the emperor tells the oldest son, you have to bow down now to this idol, and he refuses, and the emperor executes him, and one by one he executes all 7 sons of Hannah in front of her eyes, because each one of them refuses to bow down to the idols. Well, now that was not enough for him just to slaughter everybody. He was determined to capture Jerusalem and to turn the temple on Mount Moriah into a temple to the Greek god Zeus, with himself in a prominent position in that temple. So that was the background to the rebellion of the Maccabean priests known as the Hasmoneans, the house of Hashmonaim, and the story is well known of how they eventually overcame the Greeks, even though they were a tiny minority compared to this Greek military machine. And when it came to cleaning out the temple from all of the idolatrous things the Greeks had put into it, they had to clean it out, but they were unable to continue with the full temple service because they had no olive oil that was satisfying the requirements for purity, that had not been touched by uncircumcised idolater, that had not been touched by, that had not been contaminated according to all of the laws of purity and impurities in the Torah in any way. They wanted to restore the temple, not in a sort of, well, if we can't do it properly, at least we'll do something. They wanted to do it in the best possible way and light the candelabrum with pure oil. Now, with no oil that had the seal of the high priest, it would take 8 days for them to be able to produce oil, because for 7 days whoever was going to do it would have to purify from contamination from the dead with the sprinkling of the ash of the red heifer, so they'd have to wait 7 days before he could even start. Only on the 8th day would they be able to get freshly squeezed oil. So the miracle is well known that the priests searched and searched through the temple, and there they found 1 flask of oil, and that sufficed to light the lights for 8 days. And for that reason, the following year, the sages instituted a festival of thanksgiving in order to give thanks for this miracle. Interestingly, Chunakah is not a time specifically for making feasts of thanksgiving. It is mentioned in the Jewish law codes that it is appropriate at that time to make feasts where people will gather to sing the Chunakah songs and tell the stories, but it's not actually a requirement as in on the Pesach or Purim, because Purim is a celebration of Israel's physical survival. For that reason, we celebrate Purim more physically with the eating of the Purim feast. Chunakah is a survival of Israel spiritually against contamination by Greek paganism, and therefore the celebration is the spiritual light of the candelabrum, and the thanksgiving of Chunakah is the recital each of the 8 days in the synagogue of what is known as the Hallel. Hallel is Psalms 113 through to the end of 118. This is a section of the book of Psalms that is a coherent whole, giving thanksgiving for all of the miracles that have happened to Israel, the going out from Egypt, the splitting of the Red Sea, the splitting of the River Jordan, and also all of the miracles that come to each and every soul. And the Hallel is recited on each of the main festivals, on Pesach, on Shavuot, on Sukkot, and it's also ordained to be recited in full for all of the 8 days of Chunakah. Here is an interesting difference between Chunakah and the American festival of Thanksgiving. It says in the rabbis told in tractate Avodah Zarah that at the end of days, all the nations will say, God, why do you reward Israel? We've done our part too. Let us, you never gave us the Torah. Give us at least one mitzvah that we could do, and in that merit you'll reward us. So he says, okay, I have one mitzvah that is quite easy to perform. It's called sukkah. What you do is you build a temporary dwelling with a roof made of leaves and branches, and you stay there for 7 days, eating and drinking and sleeping there. So that's easy enough. Everybody does it. They go out to the sukkah, and then God takes the sun out of its sheaf, and the weather becomes not just like a Houston day to day, more like in the middle of the desert of Texas at the height of summer. The temperatures in 150, 160, and at that point everybody throws out the sukkah and go inside to get into the air conditioning. And well, now Chunakah also, it's one thing to have a great family reunion for one day, but for 8 days, day after day, every evening with the family, to sit down and for an hour to light the candles, to sing the songs, to be together, to tell the stories, a minimum of 1 hour of it, that is a service. And then every morning to recite the Hallel, which at times is sung with a full choir and musical composition. It's a real service. It's a service to no less than the service of the 7 days of Passover or the 8 days of Sukkot. Although Chunakah is a rabbinically ordained festival, it is has the same duration, and you are allowed to perform labor on Chunakah, but the services are also quite fill up the day, each day for 8 days. But now to introduce what the miracle is all about, I'd like to relate a midrash, a tale that is found in a work that was written about 150 years ago by a rabbi in Poland by the name of Rabbi David Horowitz of the town of Yaakov, who wrote a book by the name of Imre Noam, which means words of pleasantness, which is about the Torah festivals of the year. As the introduction to this part, let's recall on the portion of last week's reading, the portion of Vayishlach, speaking about Jacob before his encounter with Esau. Jacob has taken all of his family across the river from outside of the land of Israel into the land, his wives, his children, the flocks. He's brought everybody across. And after that, all of a sudden, he's left alone. And a man is there who starts wrestling with him. And he can't win with Jacob, but he does manage to knock him in the hip. And he practically cripples him. Jacob can't walk after that, even though he gets out alive. So the question is, why was Jacob alone all of a sudden? If he'd already taken everybody across the river, what more was there to do? They're across, go forward now on the journey. But no, Jacob went back. For what did he go back? Our rabbi said he went back because he'd forgotten flask of some kind, like a plastic bottle. In our time is the equivalent of an earthenware flask. In those days, that was the disposable crockery of the time, very easily breakable. Why would you go back for a flask? That shows, say our rabbis, how the righteous value their property. Nothing is too small not to be considered some value. We sweat our guts out to earn our money. We should respect and take care of our property. He showed that even for a little flask, you've got to go back and bring it, and he paid heavily. If he'd not gone back, he might not have wrestled with the angel. He might not have been hurt in his hip. When Noah was in the ark, trying to ascertain if the floodwaters had subsided, he sent out the dove. And the dove came back to the ark with a sprig from an olive tree. And on the sprig was an olive. And Noah squeezed the olive oil into a flask, because this was the first sign that the world had come through, that the world had been saved. So he wanted to preserve this moment forever. He squeezed the oil into the flask. And Noah gave that flask to his son, Shem. And Shem gave it over to his grandson, Ever, who gave it over to Abraham, who gave it to Isaac, who gave it to Jacob. And that was the flask that he went back to fetch. And Jacob gave it to Levi, because Levi was his trusted son to hand over the Torah. Levi gave it to Amram, who gave it to Moses, who gave it to Joshua, who brought the flask back into the land of Israel. And Joshua gave it to the judges gave it to the elders, the judges came down to the prophet Samuel, who gave it to David, who gave it to Solomon. And Solomon brought it into the temple, and there it was put away, presumably among the temple vaults. And there it was. It survived the destruction of Solomon's temple by the Babylonians. The second temple was rebuilt, and when the Greeks were driven out of the temple was cleansed, and the priests were searching for oil for the candelabrum, the menorah. They found the flask. And that was the flask which was the source of the Chunakah miracle. Because oil signifies wisdom. Our brains actually need oils and a very refined nutrients in order to burn the light of intelligence and Rabbi Nachman describes the human soul, of which it's said in Proverbs that a light of God a candle of God is the soul of man. Ner Hashem nishmat Adam, a candle of God is the soul of man. That actually the body is burning up the nutrients, and the best of the nutrients come up to the brain. The brain is like the wick, and the nutrients of the oil, and the consciousness and the ability of the soul to experience and sense and live, that is the light of the candle. It also speaks about the anointment of Aaron in the Psalms, the oil coming down where the high priest was anointed, the kings would be anointed. Oil signifies spiritual blessing coming down from a very high place and reaching. We see how oil is so readily absorbed by everything and by many things. Oil is the concentrated strength of the fruit and this is signified in the oil of the candelabrum. Well, now the attack of the Greeks on the Torah is pernicious and continues until today. The Greeks were deep admirers of rationalism. They would not want to believe anything that could not be proven either by logic or by investigation. For them, the concept of blind faith was out of the question, particularly blind faith in every seventh day resting from all of your, just coming to a stop, which is economically apparently outrageous. The idea of taking the beautiful human body in its natural form and taking the male at a tender age and slicing off the foreskin and leaving them, in their eyes, maimed and impaired for life. People, the illogic of not being allowed to eat meat with milk, and not being allowed to wear linen with wool, and not being allowed to do all kinds of other things. And if somebody dies and somebody touches the body, which they go and they search for a red heifer and they burn it up and they sprinkle it, and the whole thing defied reason. And the second thing, which was intolerable to the Greeks, was that the Greeks loved everything about the wider world and saw the tremendous powers manifested in the world. They were very understanding of the powers of the stars and the planets, the powers of fertility and war and love and all the other powers. And they saw each one as a god, and they couldn't put it all together and believe that it's all one. And the idea of the Jews that we have to believe that it's all one, and if it's all one, we're under so many compulsions to go against rationality, was completely against the Greek way of thinking. It was not that the Greeks were normally antagonistic to other people's religions. On the contrary, both Greek and Roman culture were very ecumenical. They would absorb in, join in everywhere as they expanded their empires and they came upon new. I heard that the wife of President Bill Clinton at her Christmas tree would actually bring in front of the tree would be little idols or of every possible culture in the world. A modern latter-day example of the comprehensiveness of Greek, Roman, and subsequent Western culture, which is not the case with Judaism, with Torah teaching, which is very emphatic that there may be no visual representations of any god. There be certainly no sculpture, no statue that will not permit any such representations. This was all intolerable to the Greeks, and that was the what fueled the ferociousness of their attack on Israel at that time. They wanted to forbid circumcision. They decreed it was not allowed to circumcise children. They forbade the observance of the Sabbath. They forbade the whole ceremony of looking for the new moon in order to determine the lunar months. On the contrary, going by the lunar months for them was completely irrational, because everybody can see that the world works on a solar system that repeats every 365 days, where if you follow the moon, your calendar's going all over the place. You have to invent all kinds of mathematics to synchronize the lunar year with the solar year. So they banned these three things: Shabbat, circumcision, and the celebration of the new moon. And in fact, in Chunakah always has one Shabbat. Since it's 8 days, it must have one Shabbat, and sometimes there's two. In 8 days, a child born on the first day of Chunakah will be circumcised if he's healthy on the 8th day of Chunakah. And the new moon of the month of Tevet always falls during Chunakah. Chunakah straddles 2 months. Our present month of Kislev, Chunakah begins on the 25th, and the new moon of Tevet always falls in the later part of Chunakah. And so in this way, Chunakah is a living evidence of the victory over the Greek attempt to outlaw circumcision and Sabbath and new moon. But now, in case we think this is all history, we have seen with our own eyes in the last few years a ferocious assault in Europe and also here in America against circumcision. In other words, not just saying that, well, a certain group of people does not want to have their children circumcised, but a new movement among academics, among intellectuals, among people who consider themselves to be the leaders and at the forefront of the culture, legislators, politicians in Poland, in Germany, in Sweden, in Norway, getting up with tremendously subtle arguments about why circumcision be banned and outlawed for everybody. In the name of freedom, it is now being said, you could examine this in a year ago in Germany, judges in Cologne ruled that circumcision is unlawful for a child. And subsequently, the decision was somewhat overturned, or they're re-legislating because Germany feels somewhat bad about this happening today. The situation is far more serious in some of the other European countries. But reading through the decision of the judges of the Cologne court, what they said was that the circumcision of a child on the 8th day or any time until they become a mature individual that is capable of making a decision for themselves is an intolerable assault on their freedom, because by submitting the child to circumcision, you cannot reverse it. And since it's irreversible, the child never had a choice. And since everybody is entitled to have free choice, the child must not be circumcised until if he chooses to do so, he may do so when he reaches the age of maturity. Well, this is a total negation of the Torah law stated in Genesis in the story of Abraham's circumcision, and restated in Leviticus, that the Israelite child, if he's healthy, must be circumcised on the 8th day after birth. No question about whether he wants to or not. The circumcision is one of the main qualifications for the male child to be a member of the people. Because if he's not circumcised, for one thing, the Torah says that an Israelite that is not circumcised and does not circumcise himself is cut off from the collectivity of the souls of Israel. He's subject to the penalty of karet. And this is what the Greeks then want to do, and this would appear to be the motivation behind the contemporary attack on circumcision. It's not only against circumcision. Across Europe now, the Jewish ritual slaughter of animals has either already been banned or is coming under bans in the various parliaments of Europe. Holland, Belgium, Switzerland, Poland, it's happening all over again, just like the 1930s. It's quite horrendous. I mean, if you follow actually what's going on the ground. Now, the fact that all this is totally ignored by the mainstream media is indicative of why the Chunakah miracle is so important to Americans who stand for the original principles of this wonderful country. Because today's mainstream media are concentrated in the hands of a very small clique. There was a time when in every American city there was an independent, at least one, if not more, newspapers. There were many newspapers. Today, when newspapers are mostly folding up, unless they are very large, and where the media dominated by a few major networks, we have a new cultural assault on every one of us, and more seriously, you have come here tonight, but our children who are exposed, if they are allowed to open a computer or a television, if they're in public school, they are exposed to a world that is nothing like the world of the original settlers, nor indeed of the founding fathers, nor those who wrote the Constitution. In terms of thought and belief and outlook, the people who appear to be directing present-day America through from the White House and through the forces that lie behind the White House, through the judiciary and through the legislature, we see that in contemporary America, for example, in a public school, it is not allowed to express any kind of religion. Now, there are many justifications for this, because if one person is allowed to express his or her religion, he will be possibly influencing somebody else who, it is argued, that other person's freedom is limited by his. So you limit his freedom in order to give the other person. What you actually do is you never give him the opportunity to discover what he's supposed to choose between. So he has only one option, which is secularism. In his biology class, he's only exposed to a biology that's still founded on the theory of evolution, even though there are gaping holes across it from beginning to end. In his school, he's not even taught to read the Bible, because that might influence him to something. So he's taught philosophy, he's taught literature, he's taught in his or her exposure to the outside world through the media. You know as well as I do that kids from the earliest ages are exposed to every kind of evil and corrupting influence. It is available with a few taps on a smartphone, with a few mouse clicks on a computer. If they have access to internet or phones, they're immediately in a jungle with serpents and wild animals, and this has become so enveloping that we are at a loss to know what to do with it. People have taken their children out of the public school system and are homeschooling. In our communities in Israel, in the Orthodox community, we are forced not to have any internet in the house. We certainly never have television. The internet may be used only for adults who are using it for work. Our children have no access whatever to internet. If they have a phone, and a mobile phone is very important in Israel where there are many security issues, it's certainly not going to be a smartphone. It's not going to be a phone that has access to internet. At best, it will be a phone from which you can talk, and you probably can't even text with it in our community. So we are forced to insulate our children if we wish to preserve the pure oil of the wisdom of the Torah. Because what we are seeing in the world we live in today is again an assault of Yavan, Greece, in a new form. It is paganism. There is no one God. There is the God of enjoyment of food and drink, restaurants, cuisine, cooking, product, supermarket. There's the God of sport and physical prowess, physical excellence. There are I'm not even going to talk about the gods of pornography and of the entertainment industry. If pornography is relatively slightly under wraps, we all know that the mainstream entertainment is full of suggestive images from morning till night. Right. Sex, violence. So who are the heroes? The heroes are the warriors, the people who can kill people all around them, the people who are seductive. This is paganism. It's pure paganism, and it is a very great gift to us. And this is what we're really giving thanks about on Chunakah. That God has brought us to a stage where He's showed us that His ancient word speaks to us today, has meaning today, because His word is infinite. It's once we get into the original text, the Hebrew text, we uncover what's there. We see that all of history is cycles. That's why every year we celebrate Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, Chunakah, Purim, because the same things are happening from generation to generation. And we make the blessing over the Chunakah candles. On each night of the festival, we say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who sanctified us with His commandments," because it's a commandment to listen to the sages, and instructed us to light the Chunakah candles. Then the second blessing, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, she'asa nisim avotenu be'yamim hahem bazman hazeh." You who perform miracles for our fathers in those days at this time. Now that has a double meaning. The miracle was indeed on the 25th of Kislev, and for 8 days following, the oil burned for 8 days. But it's Bazman Hazeh, in this time, in our time, in those days, in our time now. Right now, these same things are happening. And when we light the menorah in our homes, and this year will be on the night of Thanksgiving, what we may give Thanksgiving about is that the good Lord has taken us out. Each one of us, we know where we've come from and what we've been through, and what we have suffered to get to where we are at, and all of the things in our hearts until today. But with all that, I mean, the first Thanksgiving meal, they weren't all like, sitting back in a 5-star hotel with cordon bleu cuisine. They were roughly there putting together whatever they could, and but they enjoyed it all the more in the fresh, unpolluted air in those days. And we have to give thanks that with everything, all our burdens, God has taken us to where we are at. And in fact, we would not come here without having gone through all that. We have to go through what we go through because God guides us at each step of the way. And this is what we really mean by thanksgiving, hoda'ah. It's not just, "Oh, thank you so much. You were so kind. I'm so grateful to you. It means so much to me." That's all we mean. We internalize, "Let me think about your miracles, that my body is functioning. I mean, Lord, my back is feeling better after I thought I was finished. I thought I was going to hobble around the rest of my life. I thought I was going to be, premature like those old people that I so thoughtlessly laughed at, not understanding what they're going through. And all of a sudden I saw myself age, and and thank God. I mean, what you see me walking around today, you can't imagine where I was at just a couple of months back. And so does each one of us knows, if we think about our bodies, how as we discussed last night, the miracles of our digestive system and our breathing and our blood and everything else. So much to give thanks for the families in which we were born, for the train of events that has led us. The concept of giving thanks is internalizing through narrating, whether it's narrating the things we can tell others, the things we can't even tell others, but through the words of the Hallel, through the words of David's prayers, we can see our own lives and our own pain, how we were taken through such depths, but God lifted us up. So that's Chunakah in our time. And I'll just say a very quick word about the Chunakah customs. Where possible, it's preferable to light the Chunakah light early in the evening, soon after nightfall. It may be lit actually each night from the time of sunset, when the sun's gone down over the horizon. It can be lit until late at night if you could not light it earlier, but it's preferable to try to light it earlier. On Friday, those who are observing the Shabbat must light the Chunakah lights before the sunset, because it's not permitted to kindle lights after the beginning of the Shabbat. Conversely, on Saturday night, you may not light the Chunakah lights until after the end of the Shabbat. Well, now, to fulfill the mitzvah is to publicize the miracle. The Chunakah light is not just a private observance, we put it in a conspicuous place. It will be put either in the window where, of course, in America, I have to remember that it's not quite the same as our populous, crowded cities of Israel, where balconies everywhere and Chanukiot you have in the street, but now if you have people in the house, the place to put it would be in the room where everyone's going to be, in the room where you're going to have the meal, or the living room, or a place where everybody is, or everybody's going to pass by. And our custom in my family is immediately after the evening prayers on each night of Chunakah, I come home with my children, whoever's in the house, and directly afterwards we all assemble for the lighting of the candelabrum with the blessings, followed by sitting down to look at and contemplate the candles and to pray, to sing, to have fellowship with each other, and just to enjoy the glow of the candles. The lighting of the candle is said to be a moment of supreme grace, because for many mystical reasons, which perhaps we'll have time over the coming days to mention a few of, the Chunakah light, the ner, the word ner in Hebrew signifies the joining of the highest and the lowest and the middle, whereas the Shabbat candles may only be lit when Shabbos comes into the world on the seventh day. The Chunakah lamps are lit even on the weekday, which means that this very exalted light is coming down into the world. In fact, in ancient times, the preferred place to light the candelabrum would be at the entrance to a person's estate. Like if a person had a house with a yard around it and walls around it, at the gate, by the side of the gate, whether it be on one side the mezuzah, on the other side the owner of the house would light the candelabrum, and it would be lit at a fairly low level, not where passers-by would see it as they walk by. We're not talking about people driving past in double-decker buses, or we're talking about people maximum on a donkey or a camel, and they're going to see the light very quickly. The light of Chunakah shines to the very lowest of all levels. It's the great hope that the light of truth, the light of wisdom, the light of peace and joy can shine to everybody. That is the miracle of Chunakah. So it's a very special time for prayer, because the prayers that are offered at the time when the lamps are kindled is received immediately to God. Very powerful moment, very lovely moment for singing. Well, soon I'm going to invite you to raise any points, questions. Before I do that, I'd like to share with you the other melody for Adon Olam.